Thank you, Abby, for the introduction, and thank you to Children First for inviting me to speak at this event. It's been particularly good, I think, to hear the voices of children and young people threaded throughout the presentation so far. I think that's really important and really powerful. I want to start by saying a little bit about the role of our office, the role of the Children's Commissioner. We have a statutory function to promote and safeguard the rights of children and young people in Scotland. And the office was established through legislation by Act of the Scottish Parliament in 2003. So our remit extends to all children up to the age of 18 and up to 21 for children and young people who've been in the care system. And fundamentally, our role is about accountability. And we explain that to children often by saying that our job is to make sure that the promises are kept, promises that are contained within these international conventions and treaties, and particularly the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So Jules has given you a fantastic presentation on what the UNCRC is, what it's all about. I don't intend to cover that ground again, but I am going to refer back to a couple of things that she said. Incorporation of the convention is particularly significant for us as an office. So not just because it represents a generational opportunity, a hugely important next step in Scotland's children's rights journey, not just because we anticipate that it's going to drive culture change, not just because it makes UNCRC rights directly enforceable in the Scottish courts for the very first time, but for us as an office, because it gives us new powers to perform that accountability role, new powers to make sure that promises that are made to children are kept. So we have new powers to litigate, to take legal proceedings against public authorities, and to intervene in legal proceedings brought by another person. No, we don't intend to use those powers willy-nilly. Jaw is better than law generally, but they are a really important option for us. They're a really important tool for us to have available to make sure that children's rights are respected, protected and fulfilled in Scotland. We're also at a really interesting point beyond just incorporation for the office. We have a new commissioner, Nicola Colleen, who sends her best wishes to you today, who's been in post now for about 6 months. And we're also about to lay a new strategic plan in the Scottish Parliament. So that's the document that sets out the priorities for the office over the next 4 years. We've been engaging with children and young people right across Scotland in order to determine what those priorities are, and speaking to organisations that work with and support them as well. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what's been coming out through those conversations so far. So we've identified 5 key issues. You can see them up there: education, mental health, discrimination, poverty and climate change. They're not listed in any particular order. And there's also a thread that runs through all of these issues, which has come across really, really strongly from all of our discussions with children and young people, which is their need, their request, their demand to be involved in decision-making on all decisions that affect them. That's something that they are acutely conscious of, something that Scotland has to get better at. We've made a lot of progress in the last few years, but there's still some way to go. It's also important to note that although COVID was presented as a really key issue that impacts on children and young people, it was very much in terms of other issues. It was in terms of their mental health, their education, their experiences of poverty and discrimination. They raised a lot of other issues with us, as you would expect, things like vaping and smoking, drugs, personal safety, careers, cost of living, housing, racism and discrimination, AI, rather sadly and depressingly, armed conflicts in terms of all of the things that are going on in the news at the moment. And so that's going to shape and define the work that the office undertakes over the next 4 years. And you'll see that a number of those link really directly and really obviously to sport and to some of the things that both Mary and Jules and the young people have already kind of flagged in their presentations this morning. Sport can obviously have enormous positive benefits for children and young people and for their rights. Some of those links are really obvious. Participating in sport can be part of realising your rights to play and recreation, realising your rights to the highest attainable standard of health, and that's both physical health and mental health. But it also, as others have said already, it impacts on your right to education, if you consider education in its broadest sense, in terms of Article 29 of the Convention. to your development, to your right to socialise with your peers. So through sport, children can build positive relationships with their peers and with trusted adults. It can help them build resilience, problem solving, social skills. For some children, it may be an environment in which they feel safer, unfortunately, than they do in their home or their community. And of course, all of those things have social, economic, and public health benefits as well, including tackling things like social exclusion and reducing inequalities. So that's what happens when we get it right, when we build rights-respecting environments within which children can safely participate in sport of all kinds. Sport can be a hugely powerful force for good. It's really important to hold on to that. But again, as both Mary and Jules have reflected, we know all too well what happens when we don't build those environments, what happens when that goes wrong. There was a prevalence study conducted in 2011, so across the United Kingdom, which looked at those negative experiences that children had in sport. And it's really, really striking, I think. You can see the figures there. 75% of children had experienced emotional abuse. 29% had experienced sexual harassment. 24% physical abuse, 10% self-harm, and 3% sexual abuse. So some really, really significant negative experiences. And this was based on, this is obviously, it's an older study, but I think it's really striking in terms of what it tells us. One of the things that really struck me from the earlier presentation, so Abby, Charlotte, and Georgina talked about it's the job of everyone in the room to use their power wisely. And that's right. It's the job of sports governing bodies, of sports clubs, of everyone here to make sure that children's rights are respected, that children get the benefits of participating in sport while being protected from all of those risks. And it's useful to start, I think, by thinking about what the existing obligations of sports clubs and sporting bodies are. So you have a legal duty of care towards children and young people that comes from the common law. It requires you to take reasonable steps to reduce risk, and it reflects a higher duty of care that you owe to children and young people, which also is consistent with the approach in international human rights law, where children are recognised as more vulnerable than adults and therefore entitled to a higher standard of protection. What's really interesting about incorporation and about taking a human rights-based framing to all of this, though, is it encourages you to think much more broadly than just that narrow legal duty. And I want to look at a couple of quotes, I think, that kind of flag this. So this first one is from a report to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Now, it's on football specifically, but I think the sentiment is applicable right across all sports. So business must not take precedence over values. Promoting human rights must always be the force driving the major umbrella organisations' actions, and that applies to Sport Scotland, it applies to sporting governing bodies, and it applies to sports clubs. The other quote I want to give you is from Human Rights Watch, and they did a lot of research into various sporting issues and scandals across the globe. And what they're saying is the common thread is horrific governance. All sports have statutes saying they have zero tolerance of abuse, but we found that verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse is rampant. And the whistleblowers, often teenagers, are savaged by the system they look to for protection. So governance, the role of governing bodies, of organisations in putting the culture and the policies and the training and all of the support in place to make sure that these hugely significant negative impacts that children might experience are mitigated. So let's drill down into a few of these a little bit. Let's start with protection from harm. So again, Jules referred to Article 19 of the UNCRC. It's the most fundamental duty that you owe to children and young people to keep them safe. And Article 19 defines harm quite broadly in terms of all forms of physical or mental violence, injury or abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, maltreatment or exploitation, including sexual abuse. And we've seen far too many examples across far too many sports of children being failed in relation to this duty. And as a consequence, we've got a depressing number of reports and reviews that tell us what went wrong, that identify the things that we can and should do better around this. And there are far too many to cover in detail, but I wanted to pull a few of the more common threads, the more common examples out. So they look at the importance of clear and robust policies. But they also say that having the policy on its own isn't enough. You have to think about implementation. How is that policy being implemented? What do you need in order to make sure that it's being actually put into force? And that's where kind of governance and leadership comes in. You need to make sure that people are properly trained to do the roles that they have. You need to make sure that they've got support. And it's not just about those individual roles that you might have around child wellbeing and protection. It's about the whole organisation taking responsibility for keeping children safe. And it comes from the top. Are you creating an environment in which harm can be identified and confidently reported? I don't know if any of you saw some of the hearings in the United States over the last sort of year or so, where various tech gurus have been brought in to give evidence before Congress and the Senate to talk about the extent to which the likes of Facebook and TikTok and other organisations are really taking seriously their obligations to protect children online. And there was a really interesting thread, I think, that came out from that, in that the rhetoric that came from Zuckerberg and all of those other people was really strongly about how much they cared about this. But when they drilled down, when they looked at how much was being spent on it, it was an infinitesimal amount. So there's something really important there about, don't just tell us what you prioritise, don't just look at statements of values, look at how you're allocating your resources and your time and your money and your effort as well to see whether you're really taking this seriously. And Children First obviously has its child protection and wellbeing standards, which have been a hugely positive way to drive positive change. But I think UNCRC incorporation gives us an opportunity to look at how much further we can go around that, how much further we can go towards human rights standards, how much better we can look to protect children and young people. So I want you to think about not just protection from harm, not just those most obvious forms of harm, as important as they are, as absolutely significant as they are. Oh, sorry. But to think about what else you might put in place or what else might be absent in terms of a rights-respecting environment. The Centre for Sport and Human Rights did a really interesting report a couple of years ago, which is looking at child labour in sport. So it argues that the involvement of children in elite sports development meets the criteria for child labour outlined in the UN and the International Labour Organization conventions. And they flag the really significant risks within those elite environments of exploitation, abuse, injury, and other human rights violations. And they recommend that states should be much stronger on introducing and regulating matters including minimum ages, maximum hours for training and competition. Now, that report is obviously about elite sport, but I think it has a lot of relevance to sport at lower levels as well, if you look at the kinds of rights issues that they're identifying through that framework. So they look at things like the child's right to health, risk of injury from training. They look at education and the impact on education in its broadest sense. So how much kind of time commitment are you asking for from children in terms of training? How much support are you providing them to engage with other educational opportunities? They look at socialisation and family life. So how many hours and days a week are they participating in sport? Are you creating an environment in which that is a genuinely empowering socialisation opportunity? What support are you providing to help them realise those rights? And then there are a couple of areas I think that are maybe less well considered, less often considered. They talk about privacy and data protection. So Jules touched on this earlier on, but I think there's a really interesting aspect to this around data. So think about what you collect and publish in terms of children's rights to privacy. So if you think about elite sport, for instance, there is an increasingly thriving market in performance data. So analytics companies, betting companies, taking data from the internet that's published about young people, about children, about child athletes, and monetizing that through their own processes. Same is true of data analytics companies. Now, if you're a local sports club, you maybe have less to worry about in that regard. But think about your social media engagement. What information are you putting on Facebook or TikTok or Instagram? about children and young people? What consideration are you giving to their rights to privacy? How much do you know about what those social media companies might be doing with that data behind the scenes? So I don't have easy answers to that. I think it's an area that is really only just starting to be thought about. But this is a conversation. This whole event is framed as a conversation, and part of having a conversation is asking some of those questions. It's important also to recognise the inherent imbalance of power that exists between children and adults. So we know, again, from a lot of the reviews that have been carried out, that the imbalance of power between children and coaches, or children and kind of volunteers, can be a contributory factor to creating risk. But you also have to think about the imbalance of power between the child and your organisation, again, whether you're a club or a governing body. And part of that maybe is around the legal relationship that you create with the child. And there's two specific examples that I want to give of that. So the first one's in relation to football. Jules talked about work that the SFA's done around participation, and absolutely that is good and valuable work, and credit where credit's due. Shouldn't stop us, though, from calling out areas where there is more that needs to be done. And this is one area. This is something the office has been working on for a while, the situation where registrations in football, so every child has to register, and it's the SFA that determines what those registration procedures and forms are. And they're contracts. They are contracts in terms of Scots law. So we've got child footballers signing up to contracts. And the clubs are able, through the SFA's rules, to monetise those contracts for a relatively small number of elite players, but a number of children nonetheless, and restrict children's rights to move between clubs. Now, that is unfair, it's unreasonable, it's a violation of children's rights, and it's a choice that we could decide just not to do that. Cycling is another issue that's been brought up with us recently, and similarly, it's about the legal relationship that's created between the child and the organisations that they're working with. So the issue that was raised with us is that there is an events organiser, one of the big international events organisers, which is using the licensing system, so you have to have a licence to compete in cycling, to attempt to create a contractual type relationship between them and the child, which can then restrict their ability to participate in other events. And they've actually gone further, in fact, and have issued a number of letters to children in which they are threatening them with fines of up to 10,000 Swiss francs for participating in an event that they don't run, which is a frankly extraordinary approach and is absolutely not child rights compliant. And one of the real concerns is that those letters were sent out via British Cycling. So going back to that question, or that challenge that was posed for us, use your power wisely. What kind of relationship do you want as an organisation between you and the children that you work with? Do you want it to be a relationship that exploits that power imbalance? Or do you want it to be a relationship which looks at ways to level the playing field, to equalise the relationship between children and organisations? Because if you have a culture, if you have rules, if you have business models within your sport that doesn't recognise children as rights holders, which places them in unequal and disadvantageous legal relationships, and which prioritises their monetary or other value to you over their best interests, then you don't have an environment which is designed to respect their rights or keep them safe from harm. And the other important element of that power imbalance is that we know from lots and lots of research and lots of work around complaints mechanisms how challenging it is for children to raise complaints when they find themselves in those kinds of situations. And we know the things that impede children from doing so. So the fear of not being believed, the fear of adverse consequences of being punished for having raised a concern. Uncertainty even about what is and isn't acceptable behaviour. What is the organisational culture? What is normalised within that sport, within that organisation? How do children understand that what they're experiencing isn't right? And their fear of negative impacts in terms of their sporting achievement. So are you going to be prevented from competing in your chosen sport? Are you going to be held back from the team that you want to play in? So all of those things are really, really important factors to consider. There's also, we talked a lot about your obligations as sporting bodies, but children's rights are legal obligations on the state. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Scottish Government's role here. The United Nations publishes guiding principles on business and human rights. And what that makes clear is that the state, so the government, the Scottish Government, may be in breach of its own legal obligations under the UNCRC or indeed other treaties if it fails to take appropriate action to prevent, investigate, punish and redress rights violations caused by private companies or private organisations. So that means in order to comply with its own human rights obligations, the Scottish Government has to consider all of the powers and levers at its disposal to address any rights issues. And that includes legislation, it includes regulation, it might even include the attachment of human rights-based criteria to the dispersal of public funds. So when we give out public money to organisations, we quite rightly expect there to be a certain degree of assurance around how well they're run financially. There's exactly the same expectation should be in place around compliance with minimum basic human rights standards. Jules talked about the carrot and the stick when she gave her presentation, and this bit is very much the stick. The threat of what Scottish Government needs to be looking at and needs to be doing and needs to be on top of. But we don't want to get to that point. The UNCRC should be about driving culture change. The fact that you're sitting in this room today means that you are interested in taking part of that in that conversation. You want to be part of that culture change. That's really, really positive. And I know I've just done that last section was maybe quite challenging, so I want to kind of switch to something a little bit more positive at the end. And I want to talk about this idea, which again was touched on earlier, that there is some sort of irreconcilable conflict between taking a children's rights-based approach and having a kind of ruthless focus on success. And I just think that's simply not true. And there's a really good example internationally, actually, of Norway. So Norway has incorporated the UNCRC, and Norway put in place almost 20 years ago a set of principles for sport grounded in and based in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And these are two quotes from the introduction to that document, and I think they're really important. So the first one, children are children, not small adults. So you have to take a specifically child rights-based view. You can't just look at the mechanisms that you have in place for adults. You have to consider children as a distinct group. And as Jules has pointed out, apologies. You also need to consider different groups of children. That's really important as well. And then they've got, I think, a really powerful statement. When participating in sport, children should experience a friendly environment, feel safe, want to try new things, and not be afraid to make mistakes. And I think that's a really powerful articulation of what they're trying to do with this. These are the 8 principles. There's actually, I think, quite a lot of read across already to Children First's Child Protection and Wellbeing document. And they also, I think, reflect really powerfully some of the things that Grace and Ray told us earlier on. You know, if you look at number 8, everyone must be allowed to play. Number 7, on the child's terms, freedom to choose, friendship and enjoyment. You know, all of these things that absolutely reflect what we've been hearing from children and young people right the way throughout today. But I think the important thing about these is that they're framed in human rights terms. Rights are legal obligations, they're set out in law, they're enforceable, they're owned by the child. And that's a really important shift, I think, as part of that culture shift we need to make. And so what's the impact of that? What's been the impact of that in Norway? Well, if you look at the difference between Norway and Scotland at the moment, and the most recent research I was able to find, participation in sport is significantly higher in Norway than it is here. 85% of children aged 2 to 15 were participating in sport at least once a week, compared to about 67% in children, in Scotland, sorry. If anyone's got more up-to-date figures, very happy to hear them. And 93% of Norwegian children had been members of a sports club, up from 71% when the provisions were brought in. So what that very strongly suggests is that taking a children's rights-based approach significantly impacts on children's ability and willingness to become involved in sport. There are other factors, of course. It's also about the level of support the Norwegian government provides to sport, but having a child rights basis is really important. And the other thing that's really important for Norway is that per capita, Norway is one of the most successful countries in the world in sport. It's recognised pretty much universally, and so there is no conflict that I can see between rights and success. Actually, one leads to the other. If you have a human rights-based approach, you'll get more children participating in sport. If you get more children participating in sport, that will lead you to success at different levels. And so I want to leave you with that challenge, I think, around there's loads of good practice in Scotland. Loads of good practice represented by any number of organisations that are sitting in this room today and loads that aren't. But what do we need in order to underpin that? What do we need in order to allow us to seize that generational opportunity represented by incorporation of the UNCRC? What do we need in order to make sure that we fully embed children's rights in sport and reap the benefits in the same way that it appears that Norway's done? And so I do have a question for you, which I think is going to come up in just a second, which is, what would children's human rights principles look like, either in your sport or at a national level? So would love to get some discussions going around the tables. What would that look like? Thanks very much.